allow me to echo Mr. Gerson in thanking Senators Daschle and Frist for their leadership and their contributions to this report, and thank Mr. Gerson for helping guide us through not just a history of PEPFAR, not just a description of its infrastructure and how it works, but really a very touching and impactful story of the change that it has wrought on the continent and how it has changed the lives of millions. To talk a little more about what PEPFAR does today and the impact it can continue to have, I'd like to call up our second panel. Please come to the stage. Ambassador Deborah Birx, U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and U.S. Special Representative for Global Health Diplomacy. General Charles Wald, former Deputy Commander of United States European Command and the co-chair of the BPC's National Security Program. And Ambassador Mark Storella, former U.S. Ambassador to Zambia and current Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Our moderator today is Dr. Charles Holmes, who in addition to consulting on this report, is the faculty co-director of the Center for Global Health and Quality and a visiting associate professor in the Department of Medicine at Georgetown University. Prior to joining Georgetown, Charles served for 4 years as the CEO of the Center for Infectious Disease Research in Zambia, and prior to that, he served as the Chief Medical Officer and Deputy U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator for PEPFAR, and was their founding director of the Office of Research and Science. Charles.
Thank you, Blaise, and it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. And given the range of diplomatic, public health, as well as security concerns and issues that we've talked about already, we really couldn't ask for a better panel here today. I won't go into bios, but I'll just introduce, of course, Ambassador Birx, General Wald, and Ambassador Storella. And I've had the great honor of working with both Ambassador Storella and Ambassador Birx in various settings over the years, so this is really a special occasion. I'd like to start with you, General Wald. As referenced earlier, prior to PEPFAR, societies, as we've heard about, particularly those hardest hit in sub-Saharan Africa, were being truly ravaged by the HIV epidemic, with sharp declines, as we've heard, in life expectancy, rapid rises in orphanhood, and faltering economies. The new report finds that PEPFAR has been successful, and other health aid investments have been successful in impacting health, socioeconomic development, and also reducing state fragility. And because of these effects, we've heard about parallels between the PEPFAR program and the Marshall Plan. Given your background with the European Central Command, can you remind us of some of the objectives in the Marshall Plan and the advantages that had in rebuilding Europe as well as for the United States? And do you see parallels with the PEPFAR program?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was asked to prepare for this question, so I've looked it up a little bit. But for those that don't remember the Marshall Plan, I think it was at the time somewhere around $13 billion for all of Europe after post-World War II, which today sounds like not a lot of money. But at the time was quite a bit. and I've read where there's some revisionist history now that is saying that the Marshall Plan was implemented by the U.S. government to give us a better global market and increase the market of the United States, which is kind of cynical, meaning there was not a benevolence there. It was mainly for self-improvement of our economy. And I suppose there is some of that, but I think there was also the reality that Europe, I mean, if you think back on it, and I kind of think of it in today's context, why would we, President Trump is getting ready to go to the NATO summit this week. I just talked to Jim Jones this morning. He's going over there too, and there's probably not a more supportive person in the world than Jim Jones on NATO. But you have to say to yourself, why are we involved in Europe, and later we'll talk a little more about Africa, but what is in our interest there other than maybe historical relationships from generational relationships, whatever the case may be. It's in our interest to have a group of nations around the world that are stable, that we can depend on to help solve some of our security problems. I mean, We're going to hear from two really significant people here as far as our diplomacy and our government goes, which is really the primary. But there's a military aspect, and it was a little bit alluded to by Senator Frist and Senator Daschle earlier. But my feeling as a military person has always been the best thing you can do as a military person is avoid conflict, avoid involvement. So prevention is number one. If you could, I think that most military people would say, idealistically, if you could do away with the military, it'd be a good thing. I'd rather not be in combat. So the Marshall Plan had a couple things going. Number one is there was a certain amount of, I think, benevolence and just sincere concern for our European friends. I mean, I don't think any of us could imagine World War II and the devastation. And so there was a certain amount of just kindness involved. Two, there was a serious, George Marshall's probably the smartest thinking military person we've ever had in our nation. And he was smart enough to know that, that the tools of security and national security are multifaceted. Like Mike Mullen said one time, our former chairman of the JCS, the number one national security issue for the United States of America is our economy, which is ironic for a military guy to say that. If we don't have an economy, we can forget about national security. So Marshall saw that. And then I think the third part was he saw the future, that it's kind of repetitious, and that security in Europe is not necessarily guaranteed. And we're going to need a partnership there of people that could actually purchase their own military capability, train with us, and be there as a partner. So if you look at HIV/AIDS, which we're going to talk about now, I felt the same way when I was in European Command. At that time, European Command, for those that don't know or probably don't care, we had Africa in European Command, most of it, and our responsibilities were about 92 countries, 50-some were in Africa. We spent a lot of time there, and it was kind of a nascent area. It's a little more thought of today because of some of what we consider extremism or potential terrorists that are being grown there. But at the time, it was an area that was not very well known. There was not a lot of involvement beyond the ambassadors, which was great for us that they were there because they did great work. But there wasn't any real strategy involved in Africa. The strategy that evolved was basically driven by the fact that China was investing quite a bit in Africa and was kind of replacing us as what we wanted to be influential. But the HIV portion of it became a huge issue for us from the standpoint of kind of rebuilding capacity in Africa. And the more capacity our friends, wherever they are, have to take care of their own problems, the better it is for us. So that's basically the Marshall Plan comparison.
Thank you. As you know, and as we talked about in the first panel, Africa is experiencing rapid growth in its younger populations, such that by 2030, it's estimated that about 50% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa will be under the age of 20. And in a study that was referenced in the new report, the CIA in the past has called a youth bulge a destabilizing force. General Wall, I'll just stick with you and then we'll move on to Ambassador Birx. Why is a growing youth population, while being a positive on one hand, a concern from a security perspective? And what are some of the ways you see PEPFAR and other health and development programs as being essential to contributing to a brighter future for that influential population?
Yeah, I said it to Mike Gerson earlier, which I've never had a chance to talk to him about this before. But one of the sad parts about President George W. Bush's administration is he should have taken big credit for this. Now, he's not the kind of person that would. But when we first started in European Command in 2003, again, it was fairly nascent. Not a lot of people were very versant in that, hadn't been there to Africa. There was a growing instability in the continent already, as was alluded to by Senator Frist. Osama bin Laden had been in Sudan. There was a lot of activity in North Africa. We had a group of Europeans that were kidnapped in North Africa, about 40 of them. That became a big issue, and this group that kidnapped them became Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. We had issues in Mali, in Timbuktu, as a matter of fact. We had issues, Libya obviously going bad. And much of it had to do with the reality of social media with the Arab Spring, but also the youth bulge. But probably most of it was because there was communication amongst young people that started for them to there was a realization of what kind of a government they had, what kind of society they were growing up in. And there was a disenfranchisement of young people becoming pretty apparent. We had a fantastic intelligence officer in UCOM, a guy named Rick Zahner, who became head of Army intelligence, that coined the word I think he did, but this disenfranchisement of the youth in Africa. And his concern was, unless something's done, this youth bulge, I think is referred to in the report, is going to be looking for things to do. First of all, they don't feel supported by the government, number one. And number two is they really have no relief for what their life is all about. They're looking for some kind of involvement somehow in some kind of relationship. And the whole issue about paying attention to the young folks in Africa was, again, it's the right thing to do, but primarily it was a security issue for us. Well, number two is, the youthful transmission of HIV/AIDS process was really a growing issue, and the mobility of the society there was growing. So it became real apparent to us in UCOM, I think, that the HIV/AIDS program was going to be a big deal for us. And again, I took Senator Hagel, who became a SecDef later, to Africa several times, Senator Inhofe, others, that realized the amount of money that was being put into this program was going to pay big dividends. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the impact of the fact that our interest in European Command was for having Africans take care of their own security and stability. It was not in our best interest to have to do that. We'd like to help them. But the HIV/AIDS program may have turned around much of what's happening in Africa today that probably would have been 10 times worse if we hadn't had the PEPFAR program. There's no doubt about it.
Ambassador Burks, as U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, you've made the collection and more effective use of data really one of the hallmarks of PEPFAR. And one of the major issues that's come out of those data is, as General Wald referenced, we have the youth bulge, but also the adolescent girls and young women who are now accounting for 74% of the new infections in sub-Saharan Africa in that age group. Given the rapid growth of this population in Africa, it's been suggested that these high rates of infection in that age group could actually lead to a reversal of some of PEPFAR's hard-fought wins and gains over the years. Why are these rates so high in adolescent girls in the region? And what is PEPFAR doing to protect them from HIV infection? Also recognizing that HIV prevention is not just a health issue, but really has multiple societal determinants.
Well, that's a lot of questions. So, but thank you. I think we were very excited about data and the use of data because it lets us see down to the communities and the individuals. And I think when you heard that discussion about where PEPFAR was grounded in transparency and knowledge and translation of science to action, we had to be able to see everything, not just an average. I always call it the tyranny of averages. You can't look at a country on an average and say that's how you're serving everyone. And when we started looking geographically and started doing these surveys that were down to the community sites, that's when we found everybody that we were missing. And you can understand how this happened, because when PEPFAR started, it really was an emergency to save lives and to save parents. And so a lot of our treatment went to the very sick. And we had forgotten, I think it's sometimes, that you have a disease for 8 to 10 years before you're sick at all, but it's silently destroying your immune system. And so when you think about it that way, you have to realize that you had a lot of 15 and 20-year-olds that were probably infected then, but weren't visible to the healthcare delivery system. And what these surveys has allowed us to do is to see everyone. And so it's not that we have these things we call incidence rates, and then we call absolute number of new infections. So the incident rate, as was described in the prior panel, is actually dropping in all of the different age groups. But when you have twice as many 15 to 24-year-olds than you did at the beginning of the epidemic, you see that you have to, again, half those incidence rates just to tread water. And so we really noticed then that young women, and this really was a study done by Slim and Koresha Karim, who really showed us 5 years ago the risk to young women. And so we saw a lot of infections, but we didn't understand their risk. And there was a sense that it was cross-generational, institutions and sexual activity cross-gender. We really found that it was men 6 to 7 years older with women and adolescents that were 16 with a 22-year-old. And people always say to me, that's so shocking. And I'm like, well, weren't you in high school? I mean, didn't you want to date the college kid who had the car and some disposable income? I mean, this is universal everywhere. So we started really listening to young women to understand what was putting them at risk. And that's why we launched DREAMS, and that stands for Determined, Resilient, Empowered, AIDS-Free, Mentored, and Safe Young Women, recognizing that young women are in a community with multiple faceted risk. And we couldn't just approach it in one direction. And so we had to bring together, just like PEPFAR has always led in bringing people together, bipartisan and then interagency, we had to bring the Ministry of Education with the Ministries of Finance, with the Ministries of Health, and the Ministry of Gender to work together in a new way, to really look at every aspect of a young girl's life and address the issues that they're faced with. And I think one of the biggest issues we've uncovered through our violence against children surveys is about 1/3 of young girls' first sexual experience is rape. And so these are difficult questions, and that's where you use the diplomacy of data. Because when you have that objective evidence, then you can take that to these ministries and work together to address an issue that crosses young women's lives. And that's, I think you've seen our recent report. We saw between a 25 to 40% decline in new infections in young women, the absolute number of new infections, because remember, that's what's going to drive costs, absolute number of new infections in many of these communities. But like all data, it also points out where you're failing. And I think part of this bipartisan support and the bipartisan report that just came out is for us to understand where are we doing great and where do we need to do better. And I think with the young women, we can clearly see that we probably don't have programs that are optimized for young women in highly urban areas. So if you look at Johannesburg, if you look at Nairobi, if you look at Lusaka, we had a 10 to 15% decline in absolute new infections, when in many of the other areas we had a 60% decline. So what data is useful for is to point out where you're doing well, but to also point out where you're not doing well and fix it. And I think that's how we want to use data. We want to use data to both understand where we're doing well, but also where we need to fix things. And people often, data drives change. So people say to me all the time, when will PEPFAR stop changing all the time? Never, until the epidemic is controlled. Because the virus, as Senator Frist said, is tricky. And it constantly evolves and changes and infects people in different walks of life. And so you constantly have to be looking and changing to keep up with it.
So in the same way that you've worked with to make data more available and to use data, you've also opened up the country operational planning process, which is the annual planning process for PEPFAR, and made it more transparent. But you've also involved the partner governments as well as civil society. And as we heard on the previous panel, that kind of transparency is really one of the hallmarks of strategic health diplomacy. What prompted your move for that greater transparency and the involvement of both governments and civil society? And what are some of the benefits and challenges that you've experienced from that?
Well, you heard from the previous panel where PEPFAR was grounded. So we went through and looked at, and I want to thank many of the people in the audience who wrote really comprehensive reports on how PEPFAR could be better, and still do that. And we read them all the time and work in those areas. But one of the reports, and several reports said, you talk about transparency, but you're not transparent. You write these things in secret in rooms, and then you tell everybody this is what you're going to do, and the data's not available, and we don't know what's going on. So we felt like we had to be more transparent. Now, that made everybody nervous, from the agencies down to the implementing partner, that all this data was going to be up and available, and it is. So if you go to PEPFAR.gov, every data of every site, 55 or 50,000 sites that PEPFAR works in, has that data on the website so that everybody can see it. The communities that we're serving can see it, the governments can see it, civil society can see it. And part of what we do in the planning process is to bring together communities that are affected and impacted by HIV with the government who's providing services, and often with PEPFAR funding, and bringing that together so we're both listening. So we're listening to each other. And I think that's the big difference. Through listening to each other, we have been able to double the number of people on treatment in a flat budget in the last 4 years, just by listening of how we could do things better. And we've quadrupled the number of prevention impacts by increasing the circumcision number, flat budget. How do you do that? You do that by listening to the communities telling you, you're doing it this way, you'd be very much more effective if you did it that way. And these communities and governments are doing this when there's really no funding often going directly to them. People are altruistically telling us and helping us be better without paying them to help us do better. And I think that's really been the spirit of PEPFAR, and still buoys our spirits all the time when we're constantly doing change management, is to listen to people talk about and help us. And I know many of you, I see many of you in the audience who came and helped us on the DREAMS program for young women. You weren't receiving PEPFAR funding, but you wanted that program to have impact because you cared about young women around the world. And that's what we still see in this program every day, is people coming forward to help us and really bringing their intellect and their spirit and their wisdom to us every day to make us better. And that is so powerful. So keep writing your reports and keep helping us get better, because we are in this until we get control of this epidemic. You heard there wasn't a cure. There is a cure for malaria and TB. So we are working against something difficult, and there's not a vaccine. So those are being developed and worked on right now by NIH and scientific institutions around the world, and so they need to continue to be funded to do that. But in the meantime, there should be no excuse to not move forward as fast and as effectively as we can.
Can I pile on for a second? Going back to kind of the point about data, kind of the irony here is that probably 100% of you in here already know the issue. You're already supportive of more PEPFAR, you understand the problems with HIV/AIDS and the security part and all that. But the narrative has to be better. I mean, first of all, people like yourself or people in this audience understand totally, I think, what you're saying. I had dinner with, or lunch with a European parliamentarian when we were back in Africa Command, or US EUCOM. And we talked about the benefit of stability operations, or putting money into what some people would refer to as soft power, and the benefits security-wise. And he said at lunch, he said, I agree with you 100%. It's like my constituency doesn't get it. They don't understand why we're, in this case, Europe and the United States, why Senator Thune would tell me, my people in Rapid City don't understand why we're spending money on Africa when they got a pothole on 16th Street or something. And the problem is you've got to start developing the narrative. So I asked our GAO at the time, the General Accounting Office, what do you kind of estimate the amount of money that we save by actually investing in prevention and soft power? And they came back with a number that for every dollar you spend on prevention, which I would consider HIV/AIDS, PEPFAR money as a prevention of instability issue, for every dollar you spend on prevention, you save $10 in response. In other words, for every dollar you spend on prevention, you save $10 in military spending. Now, we should have more of those stories, because that's exactly what's happening to us. Now, even if you're the most heartless person in the world and don't care about humankind or other people, by the way, if you travel over there, you get a feel for why you should actually help, because the suffering is unbelievable. But just from if you're a purist that could care less about anything but the United States, those are the kind of numbers we need to have out there. And we need to have that narrative just developed. Again, very sophisticated. I love what the ambassador said, but the average American in Minot, North Dakota could care less unless they understand there's some benefit for them.
Ambassador Starella, building on the idea of developing more country ownership through the data diplomacy and the kind of transparency that Ambassador Birx talked about, you and other ambassadors, including Ambassador Kolker, have referenced ways that PEPFAR has helped you open doors in the cases of difficult relationships with governments and built a kind of trust that enabled you to pursue your foreign policy and security objectives. Could you give us an example or two of where you've used that?
Mm-hmm. Charles, amazingly, in Zambia, PEPFAR was a game changer in the United States being able to achieve its broader strategic objectives, not just our health objectives. Initially, we had a lot of trouble gaining access to the government. They didn't want to meet with us. We had the opportunity to announce our PEPFAR framework. It's a lot of money. PEPFAR, just because of its size, has real weight. And we were announcing $125 million. That really opened up doors for us with the government. And then we went to the government and said, you know, we have more money that we can bring to the table. It was really end-of-year money that we could bring to the table for ARVs, but we want you to match it. And it took 3 meetings with the president. And finally, the president said, okay, we will. He didn't actually know we were going to spend the money anyway. But anyway, it gave us the leverage, and that really helped. But there were really other areas that mattered. A big thing that we cared about strategically was democratic elections. And the elections there had a somewhat stormy and difficult history, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. And it turned out that the most important allies for the United States in pressing for clean elections, an independent electoral commission, actually counting the ballots, were the 3 mother churches, the Episcopalians, the Evangelicals, and the Catholics. We had great lines to them because they were our partners in PEPFAR, which meant we knew all of the leadership, and they trusted us. And so instead of us having to say the Electoral Commission needs to be independent, we had these churches each Sunday in the pulpit saying, we want an independent Electoral Commission, and we want the ballots to be counted. The election, as you know, took place. The opposition actually won, and the president, who was incumbent, conceded. And there was a peaceful transition in Africa on a democratic basis. We had been working to have a defense relationship with Zambia, and we'd had lots of trouble because of the history of the United States in Southern Africa. A previous president had said, the president of Zambia had said, AFRICOM will never lay a boot on the ground of Zambia. That meant China was active. That meant Zambia was not a capable partner for peacekeeping. It meant that we did not have any inroads. However, the Minister of Defense of the time and his Chief of Defense Staff noticed that our clinics that we were supporting through PEPFAR funding on bases were saving the lives of their soldiers. And not just their soldiers, but their soldiers' families too. And it took a little while, but over 2 years, that really broke things open for us. And I remember taking the Minister of Defense of Zambia to Stuttgart to meet with our commander for U.S. Africa Command. And shortly after that, Zambia offered to host Africa Endeavor, our biggest military exercise inside Africa. That happened in just 3 years. You wouldn't think it, but PEPFAR was at the heart of making that change. So I saw the real strategic results that PEPFAR could produce for American diplomacy in very diverse areas.
It's remarkable. You've spoken before about the role that PEPFAR has also played in your public diplomacy efforts as ambassador. And could you help us to better understand some of the ways in which you were able to link up PEPFAR with public diplomacy? And then related to that, one thinks about the improved public perception of the United States that we've heard about earlier. And do you think that some of these public diplomacy efforts have really helped to drive that influence of PEPFAR?
Public diplomacy requires having a good product to sell, but it also requires being able to reach the audience you're trying to sell it to. And the United States has a good story to tell around the world in so many areas. Certainly PEPFAR is a great piece of that. After being in Zambia for a while, one of the things I saw was that political leaders were important, but tribal leaders were really important. And we didn't have that much access to tribal leaders. One of the challenges that Debbie Birx has already referred to is voluntary medical male circumcision. We saw through the different analyses that this was a way of really improving our ability to combat the HIV virus. How could we convince Zambians who are not used to medical male circumcision this was a good idea? Well, the answer was to reach out to the tribal chiefs. And the tribal chiefs actually also were eager to have the opportunity to partner with us. We would go to their districts and bring all of the media with us, and it would highlight their leadership, and it would start changing ideas about practices that actually could help. That wasn't all, though. One thing that really helped us was we needed to reach young people. Young people is where the infections were. Young people obviously are the future. As General Wald was discussing, there's this bulge coming throughout Africa. So one of the things we did was when we traveled, we brought with us pop icons. So these are young TV personalities, musicians, artists, and they would go with us and they would perhaps put on a little performance. They would certainly attract huge numbers of young people to whatever the event was. But even more than that, they were on their machines texting and tweeting. And I know that U.S. ambassadors are absolutely fascinating to teenagers in places like Zambia, but they found the artists and the musicians much more interesting. So we reached a much, much wider audience. That was something that we could do through PEPFAR. And it meant people, young people, knew the United States was doing good things for Zambia. And they were hearing it not just from us, they were hearing it from popular culture icons.
Thanks. Well, we could go much longer with this wonderful panel, but I do want to open it up to the audience for any questions you may have. Okay, let me go up here.
Dana Weckesser, Global Health Partnerships Consulting. Thank you very much. This was very enlightening. I assume this goes to Ambassador Birx. No one mentioned partnering with the corporate sector or private sector. I'm wondering if that is being done to help further everything. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We've been very intentional about our public-private partnerships, and we have tried to utilize their wisdom and intellect in new ways. So with DREAMS, with circumcision, with issues where we're not having the impact that we need to have, we put out a call to say, can you help us? And our most recent one, our largest one, was DREAMS. We also did it for circumcision with the Bush Institute. But with DREAMS, Johnson & Johnson, Gilead, Vive, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all came together, the Nike Foundation, now Girl Effects, and said, this is what we can offer to you. And that was extraordinary because Johnson & Johnson knew how to do market segmentation to reach, again, public health people. We talk in a special language that is very boring to young people. Johnson & Johnson knew how we had to speak to 15-year-olds versus 19-year-olds versus 24-year-olds and really helped us bring what they do for marketing to our public health program. In exchange, Johnson & Johnson, through the PEPFAR brand, which is well recognized in Africa as the generosity of the American people, had immediate access to another market for their American brand. So it was a bi-directional real movement, and I think it's really the core reason why DREAMS is successful. We're putting out a call right now to public-private partners to work with us on our biggest challenge right now is finding well men. Men who aren't sick. And if we want to combat HIV, TB, if we want to deal with the TB pandemic and the dual infection, we can't wait till men present with very low CD4 cell counts. And like many regions of the world, well men do not want to come to the clinic at all. So really getting into what kind of words can we utilize, what kind of information does it take to get a 25-year-old to come to the clinic to be tested and then go on treatment if they need it, or get the prevention information that they need to remain negative. So the public-private partnerships that we have now are very large and they're having a huge impact. And I think it's having an impact on the private sector as far as access to new markets. So this is really a very bi-directional movement that we've had over the last couple of years.
Question in the back.
Hello, Logan Sheets from Strategic Healthcare. My question for the panel is, in a recent development since the last reauthorization of PEPFAR funding, how important do you think funding for PrEP or pre-exposure prophylaxis will be in preventing new infections globally?
So that's a great question. And again, our job is to constantly apply the new science. So the new science that has come out is how effective PrEP can be, particularly among high-risk young people, among key populations. Just like we brought Treat and Test All, this is the next venue. We're working very closely with ministries of health and ministries of youth to really work this message into the work that we do, because again, just like young men, young people don't want to come to the clinic. They don't see themselves as ill, and remember, for the first 8 years, you feel great. And if you're not infected, you feel great and don't think that you need prevention. And so these are issues that we're working on right now with governments and communities to really understand how to bring that message forward. It clearly has a huge impact, but so does delay of sexual debut, so does preventing rape. So all of these pieces have to come together, and so we're pushing on all of those elements. And if you know us, you know that we're unrelenting in pushing in all of the different elements to ensure that we can have the maximum impact and prevent as many new infections as we can, because the new infections are moving into this group that's going to be 50% of the population. And I think we're also working with governments and with the defense forces to really understand how important keeping girls and boys in high school are, because that's where we can get messages through to young people. So we're really working in a continuously horizontal way, which I think we, as General Wald says, we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk about the billions we've invested into the health system. We don't talk about the billions we've invested in institutions for young people's health and welfare. And I think we have to do a better job of converting that message into the strategic message that is important to Americans in Iowa.
Yeah, let me just pile on. Excuse me. There's a group in the United States called the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Maybe some of you heard of it. But there are 185 3- and 4-star retired general officers that are involved in that. That's 35,000 retired military, 500 of the Fortune 500 companies, as well as NGOs. And it's advocacy for foreign aid, because foreign aid is always a last priority for a lot of people because of votes at home. No offense, senators, but the fact of the matter, most Americans think, and you're probably at the high end of the educational level of Americans, would vote that we give about 25% of our budget, I should say, is for foreign aid. It's actually 1%, and a quarter of it's what Senator Frist talked about. So we need to educate Congress as well. There was a STEM staffer in here. I hope you have the message. You probably do. But I used to take Senator Inhofe to Africa quite a bit too, and he'd pray with the presidents of those countries, and from a religious standpoint, and he's pretty supportive of the foreign aid program. He's one of the last people most people would guess would do that. Lindsey Graham is one of those people that are way on top of this thing. Senator McCain, they understand it. Goes back to what the ambassador said. We have to have a narrative that fits for people that necessarily don't think of foreign policy or foreign affairs. Or I remember the saying in Africa for us was, the Chinese give the Africans what they want, and the United States tells them what to do. I mean, we're losing the battle there, and this is a long-term issue that we need to look at as a national security issue. There's a whole humanitarian side too. There's nothing wrong with feeling good about what you do, but we've got to get the story out.
Could I just follow on with what General Wald just said? Earlier on, we talked about the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan saved the continent of Europe. If you read, and I recommend you to, President Bush's autobiography, he refers to PEPFAR as his aspiration for a medical Marshall Plan. I was very struck by what Senator Frist and Senator Daschle said about their experiences early on in this epidemic in Africa, where parts of the continent were hollowing out. What I would say is that when they hollow out, it doesn't go silent, it goes chaotic. That means there are opportunities for other infectious diseases, diseases that can spread to the United States. It means there are opportunities for radicalization. And it means there are opportunities for people to flee, which means migrants showing up on borders all over the world. The United States, I believe, through PEPFAR, has helped save a continent. That has been a strategic investment on behalf of the United States, not just for the good that we've done, which is absolutely fundamental, but for the real strategic interest of the American people going forward. So I hope that that strategic view will be really well understood and appreciated, especially by Congress as it thinks about appropriations.
Thanks for that. And I'd just say with these myriad benefits that have been identified in all of these different realms, it's very clear that required robust support must continue. And in fact, with some of the emerging challenges that we've heard about, particularly with preventing HIV in the youth, that increases will be needed in the coming years, I would imagine. With that, I would like to thank very much our distinguished panel, Ambassador Birx, General Wald, and Ambassador Starella. Thank you.
Charles, Ambassador in General, it was a terrific discussion. Thank you. So I hope everyone has a chance to, on your way out, pick up a copy of the BPC report released today on PEPFAR and strategic health diplomacy. And we welcome your feedback and comments over the months and weeks ahead. If you don't get a chance to read the report in its entirety, I'll put in a little plug to take a look at page 15, figure 6. They say a picture speaks 1,000 words, and if you look at page 15, figure 6, you'll see how all of this is interconnected. When you have a program with significant health benefits that has attributes of strategic health diplomacy, there can potentially be secondary effects that can enhance our national security interests. So please take a look at that. I'd like to conclude today's program with a few important thank yous. First off, thank you to Senators Daschle and Frist for their just tremendous leadership of this project. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Senators' staffs as well as BPC staff, in particular Hannah Martin and Jessica Mitchek, as well as our consultants, Dr. Charles Holmes and Dr. Matthew Kavanaugh. Matthew is a political scientist and director of the Global Health Policy and Governance Initiative at the Georgetown Law O'Neill Institute. I want to thank all of our panelists and moderators as well today. You know, it's really your validation of the strategic health diplomacy concept that's central to ensure support for global health initiatives and for the role of soft power in American foreign policy. So thank you for that. And finally, I want to thank all of our partners and our funders, in particular Gilead Sciences for their support, and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for spending the morning with us. We look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you for being here. Thank you.